that. Excellent. Thank you and welcome again to our October webinar for ODOT Safe Routes to School. Today, we're going to be discussing how we can engage houseless students and families in safe routes. My name is Emily Dugan. I use she, her pronouns. I work for Commute Options in Central Oregon, but I'm a part of the technical assistance provider team at ODOT Safe Routes. All right, first I want to center us in a purpose of what today's meeting is all about. Some things that we're not going to be doing today. We're not going to be learning how to become houseless service providers. We're not going to be solving the housing crisis in Oregon. If you know how to do that, I have some people you should call for sure. But truly today, our purpose is to understand how we as safe route practitioners can support houseless families and students and involve them in safe routes and to identify some strategies to do so. So with that in mind, here's our agenda for today. First, we'll go over some terminology and definitions. We'll discuss the McKinney-Vento Act and what that means for transportation and how safe routes can be a part of that. Then we'll discuss some strategies for including students in safe routes and some groups that can help support this work. Then we'll turn it over to Nathan at BikeWorks by Pear. The structure for this conversation is going to be a little Q&A between Nathan and I, and then I'll open it up to audience questions. If time permits, we'll go into some breakout discussions so that you can, in small groups, discuss some strategies for locally engaging houseless students and families in safe routes. And then finally, we'll come back together and go over some resources to help continue to grow your programs. First, I want to talk about some terminology. I'm sure all of us have seen these terms: homeless, houseless, person experiencing homelessness or houselessness. There are a lot of different terms out there, and there's none that is the correct one or the incorrect one. It's really what speaks to you. You'll hear me using houseless a lot today. Other people use homeless or use that people first language of person experiencing. This is all just to say that do use the term that resonates with you, but when working with an individual, be sure to be addressing them how they would like to be addressed, really keeping that in mind. In addition to terminology, there are some definitions that we want to clarify here too. This is from the Oregon School Board Association. I think a lot of folks, when they think of someone who's experiencing houselessness, they think of someone who is out in a public area exposed to elements, but that is not the case, and the Oregon School Board Association reflects that in their definitions. I'm not going to read all of this. We'll be sending out this presentation later. But a student experiencing houselessness can be someone living in a hotel, in a trailer park, at a camping ground, someone whose primary nighttime residence is a space that's really not designated for sleeping, for students who are living in cars, parks, public spaces, and then also they include migratory students who qualify as houseless because of those circumstances described above. So again, too, it's not a one size fits all. Houselessness doesn't look the same from student to student, and it's important to remember that. We're going to briefly talk about the McKinney-Vento Act in transportation. This was an act that passed in the 1980s. It was a bipartisan act that created funding for provision of services to houseless families. And part of that is transportation. Per this act, a student experiencing houselessness is guaranteed the right to safe transportation, and it is up to the local education agency and the liaisons to be sure to provide that. As a Safe Routes School practitioner, this is something that you can help ensure, whether that's including students in your walking school bus routes and your bike trains. Being sure to include them is something that you can help to ensure that this student does have that safe transportation option to and from school. The National Center for Homeless Education provides some general strategies under the McKinney-Vento Act that you can use to help students get to and from school safely. Some of these feel pretty obvious, using discretion and respecting the family's privacy, including that family in the planning of how their student gets to and from school. You also want to collaborate with service providers and school networks to be sure that you're getting the student and their family all the services that they need, in addition to the transportation. And again, as I said, to a way that specifically for safe routes coordinators, you can include houseless students in safe routes is by considering making your walking school bus routes or your bike train routes more accessible to students who are experiencing houselessness. And we'll go into more detail about that later as well. This is not something that you need to be doing alone. Again, as I said, too, this point of this webinar is not to learn how to become a housing provider. There are many different groups and programs that are there to support you in this work. I'd like to highlight the McKinney-Vento liaisons. As a part of that act, McKinney-Vento liaisons were created to in every district in every region of the United States and in Oregon as well. These are people who have access to resources, who know all of the resources, who are in these school districts and can provide these resources to students and families. We'll be sending out a list at the end of this presentation as well, too, with the local liaisons in Oregon. So if you don't already have a relationship with them or haven't introduced yourself, that would be a great idea. Local nonprofit organizations are another great point of leverage for supporting our houseless neighbors. Houseless providers such as shelters, kitchens are great organizations where you can create those relationships. Boys and Girls Clubs are awesome. A lot of students use those services, and the Boys and Girls Club will have the relationship with those students too, so you can better provide safe routes programming for them, as well as community action agencies too. Those are another one we really want to highlight. Community action agencies throughout Oregon provide everything from housing to food to energy assistance and can be a great resource to families and students who are experiencing houselessness. All right, and with that very quick overview, we're going to turn it over to Nathan. And I'm going to stop my share actually. Nathan, do you want to take a minute and introduce yourself?
Sure, Emily, thanks so much for the invite, and it's exciting to be here. And I appreciate that this is a part of the broader conversation with safe routes, mostly because having opened up a bike shop out in East County, it was important for me to start to change the narrative around pedestrian and bicycle and hence rolling safety out in East County due to the lack of infrastructure. And so I'm really glad that we're starting to embark on this and talk a little bit more about it. So yeah, as Amy mentioned, my name is Nathan Engkjer. I'm the Pear Works director. I oversee all of our workforce development down here at Pear, which includes a coffee shop and a bike shop out in East County, as well as the job training programs that kind of precede that. I've been with Pear for a little over 11 years. I initially came on to create the wilderness recreation program. I have a background in business as well as recreation. And so here we are.
Thank you so much. Could you go into a little detail about what BikeWorks by Pear does?
Yeah, absolutely. So backing up a little bit, we had a real niche part of our wilderness rec program, which was racing bikes. We had a number of kids race cyclocross bikes every weekend, which was pretty exciting to have homeless kids show up at 6 o'clock in the morning outside of our downtown space and take them out to race every weekend. But what precipitated from that was really this energy and this desire to work on bicycles. And so with that, and in collaboration with Selwood Cycles, we wrote a curriculum around a bike mechanic school that we house here in Pear 3 times every year. It's an 8-week course. Kids meet once a week, and we pay them a stipend to actually get through the course. From that, I was presented with an opportunity to open up a bike shop in collaboration with the Rosewood Initiative out in East County, which is technically on the border of Gresham, East Portland, and did so about 5 years ago. And as part of that, in a continuation of our bike mechanic school, we employ youth that have gone through that program to then further their mechanic skills under the master mechanic that I have managing the shop out there. We have a free bike program, which is a referral program through Rosewood right now. And we're a very low barrier to kind of no barrier shop insofar as repair and sales and whatnot. So we operate on a sliding scale for the community out there.
I'm wondering too if you could speak a little bit to how you have recently become involved in Safe Routes to School through ODOT.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I had mentioned, Safe Routes was really important to me kind of from the onset of wanting to incorporate that in what we did out at the shop. And so with the first shop manager that I'd hired, the two of us, decided to start utilizing the Safe Routes curriculum at some of the Sun School after school programs. And while that was fun and exciting and working with some of those elementary kids, it really wasn't sustainable for what we were doing out there. And so I started writing some grants, and through Metro and now through ODOT. Fast forward to, I think we're year 4 now, we have 2 Safe Routes coordinators working in conjunction with Multnomah County in the schools out there in East Portland.
That's awesome to see how that grew. What is one of the most important things to remember when working with houseless youth?
Yeah, I think, there's a couple of things, right? Like, these kiddos are just like any other kiddos. They want to be engaged with, they want to laugh, they want to be seen. But I think one of the most important things that really differentiates a lot of the homeless youth that we encounter is that they are all deeply affected by trauma. Often this looks like them with food insecurities, suffering from hunger. They've got often poor physical and emotional health. It shows up as depression, anxiety, attachment issues. And that's really kind of one of the things that I want to focus on here is around that trauma piece, and like what we can do as practitioners to start to bring trauma-informed care into the fold. And so we can talk about that here in some of the follow-up questions, but I think that's one of the biggest pieces that I hope folks can walk away from today.
Yeah, that was actually my next question, was what training and resources you recommend for working compassionately with these youth. And if you want to speak more to trauma-informed care and what that looks like in your practice at BikeWorks, that'd be great.
Yeah, so there's a number of resources. And so first and foremost, I'd like to really encourage folks to, really reach out to see what those resources are within your communities. And there are a number of them, no matter where you're at across the state. Obviously, some run a little deeper than others, but I think that that's kind of one of the more critical pieces here in the Portland area. We're lucky to have 211 as a resource, and they can be really helpful in identifying like what those specific resources are that you might be happening to look for. When we look at trauma-informed care as something that we can bring into our own tool belt as a resource for working with these kiddos and subsequently their families, there's a National Center for Trauma-Informed Care, Trauma-Informed Oregon. I think the YWCA also offers some classes as well. We've been really fortunate as an organization downtown to work with a gentleman named Jordan Banks, who, if this proves fruitful and something that people are wanting to, I'd love to bring him into the fold and see what we might be able to do to workshop as a Safe Routes to School, broader community insofar as a workshop's concerned. I think it would be a real critical training piece for everyone as we go out into our communities and working with these young folks that often can be challenging to work with because of how things present, due to the trauma. A lot of these kids experience abuse and neglect. Oftentimes there's sexual trauma. a lot of violence that has been witnessed either at home or within the neighborhoods, potentially the loss of a loved one. I mean, this is how trauma shows up for a lot of these folks. Additionally, I think without, one of the things that is really lacking is security, which is not having a safe or permanent connection, either with family members or, a broader community, which I think a lot of us tend to take for granted. A lot of them will shift their resources, which are normally earmarked for their own growth and development, and move those into sort of self-protection in order for them to really survive their environments. And I think that that is a really critical piece as we're looking at these young people and understanding like what our approach can be. How do things need to shift for ourselves as we're presenting safe routes within the schools or after school programs? And as part of safe routes programming, I would ask what work is being done to create an inclusive and equitable environment with what we're offering. I think we need to start to look internally before we can start to address what's happening externally. Additional resources, beyond what I've mentioned, for trauma informed is really just connecting with your community. Not only, Emily's mentioned a few, but there's other organizations within the community. I think churches can often be overlooked just due to stigmatizations that we might hold around like what churches, for better or for worse. I think that there are a number of other organizations within your communities that specifically work with youth that would be good to make partnerships with. Here in Portland, obviously pear, but there's New Avenues for Youth, Outside In, which is part of Janus Youth Programs. There's a number of them, but really familiarizing yourself to know what you can have in your back pocket to offer as a resource for these young folks, if that's the need that they present, is really critical to, working compassionately with these guys.
Thank you. Thank you for providing those resources too. Yeah, I know that locally too, churches can provide a lot. So that's a great one to mention as well. I'm sure that many of the Safe Routes practitioners in this room have gotten this question. So I'm going to ask you for what advice you would give them. Some Safe Routes practitioners have had concerns from families or caregivers about their students walking or rolling to school near places where houseless people are living. What advice would you give to them to address those concerns or those comments? And this is for both students walking together in a supervised group or alone.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the things that we like to bring to light is like the destigmatization of homeless individuals, groups, et cetera, right? So starting out with those conversations that we want to like really change the narrative that like, yes, what is homelessness? Talking about like reasons why people might be homeless, having those conversations with our kids are important so that we can then take the next step of either walking around a camp, because I hate the term avoidance. I think that often plays into that narrative. True, there's a lot of mental health issues, there's a lot of drug use, to name a couple, but they are just people that happen to be suffering, and it's not a choice. It's quite frankly a pretty awful way to live. That being said, there are a lot of things that should be avoided, and what we see in a lot of the homeless camps because of drug use, can be discarded needles. They often don't have proper places to use restrooms. And so unfortunately, there's urine and feces and a lot of stuff that technically is really unhealthy and unsafe for our kids and or adults. And so while I don't feel like we should neglect to recognize them as folks, my suggestion would be to find what is the safest route to navigate around a homeless camp.
Thank you. I appreciate that nuance too there of recognize people as people, but also looking out for safety. Final question before we open it up to the audience. We talked about ways that we can support and bring students into safe routes. What advice would you have for safe routes practitioners to not just do that, but also to empower youth to be a part of safe routes and to help create these programs and be a big part of it?
Yeah, I think a big piece of this is connection. How are you connecting to these youth beyond just the curricula, right? I think helping them to recognize that they are strong and capable people is really one of the biggest tools that you can use to empower them in their being. It's important to connect, obviously, with all folks, but particularly critical for these young people so that they can feel seen and that they can be heard. Because often for folks that are experiencing homelessness, they're the last ones to be seen, and they often don't have a voice. So bring them into the fold so that you can actually give them those tools, and not just tools, but opportunities for those things to happen.
Thank you. Yeah, I think you had mentioned in our conversation previously that at Pear, it's not what do you need, it's how are you doing. And I really like that.
And it's true, because otherwise it just becomes transactional, right? We want to move beyond just like filling that need, but making space for what's going on for this young person, right, in that moment. And that's going to change on a day-to-day basis. And I know that we don't see these kids every day. So that also presents its own challenges. But I think it's a place to start.
I agree. Well, thank you. I think you covered all of the questions that I had. So now I'm going to open it up to the group. Feel free to raise your hand, unmute yourself, put your comment or question in the chat. And yeah, just go for it. I'm going to let us sit in awkward silence for a minute to see if there's any questions. Oh, we have a hand raised. All right, go ahead, Danny.
Hey there. So I'm Danny Schulte, transportation planner for the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation out in northeastern Oregon. And so I bet you can anticipate what my question is going to be. How do you do this work in rural areas? You know, when you know, I know that there are services and resources out here, but there's not a lot. And so it's kind of harder to connect with those community members because I just don't know where to find them, you know. And homelessness looks a little different in a rural community. It's a lot more like sleeping on friends' couches. And so it's not like there's camps in the same way that there's camps in urban spaces.
Yeah, it's true. I think that the work does become a bit more challenging, and I think that finding creative ways in which you can utilize the resources that are available. And you know, I'm a really firm believer in building bridges with everyone that's willing. And so, you know, when you're in relationship, I think you are able to sort of parse out things that people might be able to do that aren't necessarily like upfront and present, right? You know, they say it takes a community, right? And I'm a big believer that it does. And so if we continue to reach out to all of those folks, I think you'll find things and opportunities and resources that people are willing to kind of do that might not traditionally stand out, such as, you know, downtown, say, shelters or food resources, or not a whole lot of mental health stuff going on anywhere, it seems like, but yeah.
Additionally to Danny, we have a specific resource for transportation in rural areas for houseless students, and we'll be sharing that at the end of the presentation as well. And I'd also recommend the McKinney-Vento liaisons as well as a good resource for that. But, all right, Carolyn, you have your hand up.
Sure. Hi, can y'all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Hi, thank you so much for your time. I super appreciate it. Yeah, I'm really curious, I think we all can understand how, in Safe House to School, these routes are, prioritized in a certain way for a certain purpose. But, at the end of the day, our like houseless community members are going to, sleep on routes that are safer, as they should in some ways, right? The goal is, vision zero and not having anybody get hurt. So there's kind of that wicked problem there, right? How do you grapple with the prioritization of, those two communities? Or how do you think about that?
Two communities being youth involved in Safe Routes programming and students in, experiencing homelessness. Those two communities, is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, people who might be camping and students going to school. And you don't have to answer right now. I'm just kind of curious how you think through those like nuances.
Yeah, I mean, it's challenging on a number of different fronts. And I think that sort of unfortunately it's become so politicized that and such a kind of a hot topic, at least out here in Portland, just because things have exploded really since COVID, I feel like. And it is sort of untenable. And, while we have been working with youth for over 20 years now, it has really reached, kind of that next level of, yeah, like, what do you do? And I don't think that there has been put forth like a very good way forward as of to date from leadership. I think there's been a lot of like grasping at straws and not really knowing what to do, in my opinion. And because it's not safe for the folks that are in tents, whether they're on a sidewalk, whether it's spilled out into the road. And quite frankly, the fact that we've allowed this to happen is really pretty unethical, in my opinion. Also, people need not to be in a tent, but the problem is we need more than just housing, and we've lost a lot of the wraparound services that are needed to really make getting off of the street successful. Because you often can't just take somebody and put them in a house and think the job is done. So I don't know if we look at it as like prioritizing like, one or over the other. I think that one, knowing how to identify from a Safe Routes perspective, how we can be effective with the kids that are in our programming. And like, again, kind of coming back to that trauma-informed care, if we can have that as a baseline for our approach in working with these young folks so that we are not re-traumatizing them in any way, most likely unknowingly, right? But if you don't know what you don't know. So I would love to see this. I mean, I think this should be a part of all teachers' trainings as well. But we need to start somewhere. And, I don't quite know how to address your question so far as the intersectionality between the two. That community versus the other. I think that we can look at this as like youth that are experiencing homelessness that are in our programs and how we can approach that. Yeah, I don't know if I have a great answer for you.
No, I totally hear you. That's perfect. Thank you so much.
Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Carolyn. That's a great question and something to continue to consider. I want to draw attention to Carly Rice's comment here in the chat. I think it is important to note that homeless youth generally don't live in camps, even in urban areas. Most homeless students are doubled up, couch surfing, or sleeping in vehicles. They are the kind of population that is often ignored in the conversation the community has about homelessness in urban areas. And I really appreciate that comment, Carly. That speaks again to this definition of homelessness being very broad. And yeah, but did you want to comment on that?
Sure. I'd be curious, like, Carly, what age you're talking about when you speak to youth, because we define youth as young folks ages 15 to 25, and pre-pandemic we saw 75 youth a day who actively were in camps. And it's true, yeah, some are couch surfing, some are in shelter, but a large majority of them were actively living on the streets. So if we want, I don't know if we're looking at younger people or per your conversation of who's.
Yeah, Carly, feel free to unmute yourself if you want to respond to that.
Sorry.
No worries.
It was more like elementary and middle school populations.
Yeah, I mean, the real young folks, I would agree. They often probably are, on the fringe, in vehicles, couch surfing in relatives, homes, doubled, tripled up. And I think that is the big piece to bring into the conversation, right? In how we can best I think approach the homeless issue, and like who we are more likely to be seeing in our programming, right? Because the youth that we see aren't in school, they're not in safe routes programs, and so I think that's kind of the point of this, right, is to bring this to light so that we can figure out how we can best help and aid and, as one question said, empower these young folks. And so, again, I think they want to be seen, they want to be heard, they're often ignored. And so that's very true.
Logan, we'll get to your question in a second, but I also wanted to point out what Lale's question here, that the data has changed since the pandemic. I'm sure I'm going to get the statistic wrong, but I think at the most recent point in time count in Deschutes County, a large percentage of the folks experiencing houselessness have become houseless in the past 2 years. So we're seeing the pandemic really compounding the housing crisis as well too. And so those statistics have definitely changed.
That's true.
Yep. Logan, if you want to go ahead and ask your question.
It's up there. Oh, okay. Hi, this is actually Sarah Mazie, Safe Routes to School Coordinator in Eugene. And I just wanted to say that I really appreciate this webinar, and I appreciate your sharing your experience and knowledge in this area, Nathan. And I would love to have a statewide training on trauma-informed care as it relates to Safe Routes to School. And I would also love to have a statewide training or discussion on Carolyn Chris' question about just that intersection of all age students walking and biking and using street space, and that safety question for them as they're encountering camps and people experiencing houselessness. And I, good. And just, I mean, how dealing with that, it's so thorny and painful. I agree with you, Nathan, that it's just unethical the way that we have allowed so many people to be living in this way in our communities. But it's not something that, it's a huge issue for safe routes to school, I would say, in Eugene, and I think in a lot of our urban areas. That being said, I think that it's really interesting. Sorry, this is kind of like comments and question. I would just love to hear your thoughts on what I'm saying too. When I've tried to interact with our McKinney-Vento liaisons, they're providing the busing. They're making sure those students are bused to school. And so it's almost, I've had this sense of like, safe routes to school, you can step out of the way. We got it. These kids are getting bused. But Nathan, you're saying, well, these kids aren't actually going to school. And I know you're talking about an older population, so maybe that's part of it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that there are opportunities that safe routes to school is not just about those 2 moments in the day, getting kids to school and getting them home. There's also a lot that we're providing around skill building and kind of building active and shared transportation habits for life. And I think that I'm inspired hearing you to make some connections with service providers here around some of the other programming that we're offering and making sure that it's getting to other kids in our communities that may be in school, may not be in school, or maybe even just need extra because they're, like you said, not necessarily able to focus fully on their growth. They're just trying to protect themselves. So anyhow, just I guess maybe the question in there is how would you suggest it for a safe routes program? What's the best way that you see for us intersecting with service providers, and what are some more of the opportunities that you see from this service provider role? Or you've got both roles, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, so real quick, there's an organization that's newer down in your area called CORE. And I can make an introduction if you're interested in the chat. I'd be happy to email you those guys if you don't know about them already. They do some real similar stuff to what Pear is doing here in Portland. I think that, again, to your question, how can we best situate ourselves to, because we're not going to be able to you guys are already doing so much, right? That I think becomes challenging to then ask, which is what we often do of teachers, to do, X, Y, and Z, and have them be now the parents and the mental health counseling and all that kind of stuff. Like, it's also not a sustainable role for them to embark on. And to what Emily spoke to earlier, like, we can't ask ourselves to also take this stuff on, but what we can do is, educate ourselves around an approach to working with these kids. And I really think that is the best place. And you had mentioned, like, hey, you would love to have a statewide training around trauma-informed care. I think that's something that is very doable. I've already reached out to Jordan just insofar as some potential next steps around, just costs, but like, what would a workshop look like? We did here at Pear a couple years back. I think it was 4 evenings, 2 hours each was kind of his whole thing. But like, is there a way to like kind of parse that down so it's a half-day workshop? Because I know everybody's busy, to where there's enough information that we can ingest and still be effective in understanding kind of like and have a baseline for how do we identify folks that are dealing with trauma, and like, what is the best way to then like approach them around that. So that would be, coming back to what I said earlier, kind of where I think we need to start. And ultimately, like, it is on all of us to kind of build out our community insofar as making relationships with some of the other services that are out there.
Nora, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, I just, Nathan, something that you mentioned earlier that is just something that always resonates with me is the idea of like looking internally before acting or looking externally for solutions or direction around these challenging topics. And I think there's a lot of opportunities for reflection and looking at biases and things like that. I was just curious if you had any like questions that you've asked yourself or questions that you like to share with people that would be interesting or fruitful, especially in the Safe Routes to School context when it comes to starting that internal work or continuing internal work.
Good question. I think the biggest way that we can have impact is, as you said, like looking internally and figuring out like what I've had to ask myself is like, what do I need to do to heal internally so that I can be effective to those around me? And kind of looking at my own traumas. And I've been very privileged to be white, be a male. I've been extended all of those things just because of that, and really having to like peel back, a lot of those layers, and do the work just from an equity, racial equity standpoint. But again, also just looking at like my own traumas. If we can't heal from those, I don't know how it is we're going to have an understanding so that we can effectively, work with those that are experiencing things that like maybe we don't even like to think about, right? So I start there, and those are often like pretty hard questions, but ones that you can only ask yourself. I think that being open to some of these trainings will bring up some other questions for you as well. I think being, we talked about like making connections within our communities. How can we be actively, listening to where we can then really pull other folks into the fold and utilize those folks, because we can't do all of this, as an individual. So how do I heal emotionally, physically, so that I can have that impact with these kids? Because if we can't get there ourselves, I don't know how we're able to extend that to others. And I know I just was a broken record there for about 2 minutes, but I think that's where it really starts.
No, I think that reiterating that is great, and doing the self-work and the organizational work first before trying to endeavor on this is going to make you a more effective leader in person. I think we have time for one more question before we move into our breakout rooms. So if there's any last question, go ahead and share that now. And if not, then we can move into our breakout rooms.
I also put my email in the chat, just if anybody has questions later on down the road.
Yes, thank you for doing that. And I'll share that out as well too with your permission in our follow-up email. All right, with this, we're going to move to breakout rooms. I'm just going to randomly assign those now. We'll do about, how many people do we have? 5 people per room. So I'll start assigning those now. And we'll take about 15 minutes for this. And sorry, it always takes me a moment to do this. Nathan, would you like to be included in a breakout room?
Sure, happy to be.
Awesome. Great. All right, so those are opening now. I'm going to pause our recording for the moment here. The fact that not everyone returned all at once when the rooms were closed makes me think that there's some good conversations going. I would love to have some time to share, but just to respect people's time, we're going to move to our closing resource sharing. Here's some resources that we discussed today. This is the list of community action partnerships throughout Oregon who can provide different services for families experiencing houselessness. We'll be sharing out to our list of McKinney-Vento liaisons. And then this is a resource, the National Center for Homeless Education. They have a lot of resources available for supporting folks experiencing houselessness. And then, of course, we have Bike Works by Pear, which is a great resource to check out, especially if you're in the Portland metro area. They do a lot of great work, as you heard from Nathan. So with that, I want to thank everyone for being here today. We'll be sending out some resources. Yes, Danny, I see you have your hand raised.
I just wanted to share a resource in the chat that's like it's more of an informational resource. It's got to do with like if you have trouble connecting with a homeless person in your community, this is like investigative journalism about the homeless resource, like the 211 process that's, maybe kind of inform that, like how you understand like the struggle that they're going through.
Thank you. And I say it's 99% invisible too, which is one of my favorite.
Yeah, it's a series of four podcast episodes called According to Need. It's very good.
Yes, if you've never checked
exploration.
out 99% Invisible, I definitely recommend it. Thank you, Danny, for sharing that. We'll be sure to share it in the follow-up email as well. Yes, you'll be getting all of these resources in a follow-up email. And Nathan, with your permission, I'll also share your email as well too, so folks can contact you. So thank you again, and thank you especially to Nathan for coming and talking. This was a great conversation, and I feel personally very inspired as well. So thanks so much. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.